Now, we have detailed obligations to the FAA in terms of setting our goals. We just don't pull them out of the air. Uh, the proposed goal for the concessions program is 35%. We are required by federal regulations to monitor and implement mechanisms to ensure compliance with the regulations. And this all is a new area of responsibility. In rewriting the regulations, the FAA and the DOT have really imposed additional obligations on the airport recipients. And those additional obligations include more proactive compliance monitoring, more proactive mechanisms to monitor what is going on. So we do field tests. We go out in the field, look at the operation. We'll ask an employee, well, who employs you? See if they know who the owner is. And we'll do those types of tests in order to make sure that there is an active ownership, there is compliance, and whatever is being represented to us as the ownership structure is in fact the ownership structure. This is good faith efforts, and it's kind of a long deal. It's more really suitable for lawyers than it is for lay people, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. And cutting to the chase, what all this means is if you are a certified ACDBE, if you are certified, and I quote, you must be certified. If I were in church, I'd say repeat, must be certified. If you are a certified ACDBE, then your participation is counted toward the ACDBE goal. So if you have a 51% ownership in the venture, then, and we have a 35% goal, your 51% ownership satisfies the goal. If you are a non-ACDBE, and by that I mean you are a MWBE, you may be an uncertified ACDBE, or you may be a majority firm. Under those circumstances, whichever category you fall in, you must demonstrate a good faith effort to achieve the goal. Is that clear? So that's the rule, and that's how it's applied in terms of good faith. We have all kinds of regulations on the joint venture guidelines. And these were promulgated after the 2005 regulations. And again, what the FAA is doing and the DOT is doing is really putting forth a picture or a profile of what that joint venture must look like in order for us as administrators to count the participation. Now, I will say, and I'm going to express a preference because it's the easiest to do. If you have 3 locations and you have a ACDBE operator for 1 location who is responsible for the control consistent whatever standards you need to operate, that is a lot easier to measure in terms of making sure that they are in compliance with the regulations, because it's a single store. They staff it, they operate it, they do the inventory, all of that, and there is no question as to whether or not the value of those services is commensurate to their ownership interests. Now, there is another approach that some firms use, and that approach is they will take certain functions. For instance, they'll take the HR function, and they'll say the ACDBE is responsible for hiring, staffing, training, and the process of terminating employees. And they give that responsibility in a clearly delineated way to the ACDBE. We, as administrators, must be able to verify the role the ACDBE is playing. It must be clear, it must be independent. Now, on this second approach that we talked about, what happens is what the joint venture agreements in the past used to have a management committee. And that management committee would oftentimes be composed of 3 votes on the management committee. 2 votes would be with an HMS host or Parodies or other similar firms, 1 vote would be with the minority, or the ACDBE firm. The FAA has determined that that approach does not allow for direct control by the ACDBE. So what we're doing now, in an effort to comply with those regulations, if you don't go with the independent store approach, is to carve out functions and you set up a sub-management committee which is controlled by the ACDBE. So we reverse it. So in terms of HR functions, the ACDBE would have 2 votes and the majority prime would have 1 vote. So there is direct ownership control of that sub-management committee by the ACDBE. And that way we have clearly delineated responsibilities, we have an area of direct control consistent with the corporate structure, and we are able to measure or assess a value as to those services in order to make sure they're commensurate with the ownership interest. It's not easy in order to assess that value, and I'm going to be candid with you, which is why I think it's a lot easier if I just get a store or some large component that we can measure without any issues. There has been a fair amount of concern regarding local participation. And you know, the reason we trotted out the regulations is to make sure that our community understands that there are parameters in which we must operate in. There are clear rules and guidelines, there are regulations, and we have a responsibility as an airport, if we are going to maintain our grants and continue to receive those grants, that we comply with those regulations. We get millions of dollars for airport, airfield repairs, rehab. We get grant money. We just approved a grant, for instance, for $9 million for some roadway construction that was federally funded. So with that money, we must, if we're going to continue to receive that money, we must comply with these regulations. Now, this is probably the most unpopular of all of the rulings by the DOT and the FAA. We are not permitted to give a local preference to ACDBEs. So I go to the word, and I'm going to walk over here, and they don't equivocate. There's no interpretation. It says no. All right? So that's where we are. So we cannot have a situation in which we as the airport are giving local ACDBEs a preference over non-local ACDBEs. That's what the regulations require. So with that, I conclude my presentation.